So I'm gonna add this to my next movie or my next blog. I'm sorry. And after, in light of the information I just received about losing two people that were and continue to be an inspiration to me, um, I'm gonna call it "So You Think You Were Vibed," based on some post and conversation I've had with some musicians lately about being vibed on gigs from other musicians. So I just got a text and I looked on Facebook and we lost Idris Muhammad. So I'll tell that story first. My first encounter with Idris Muhammad was actually through Power of Soul, um, an amazing record. If you really want to know the history on that record, that's one of those kind of like Hank Crawford, Grover Washington Jr. stories. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that means you're not really doing the research to understand what I mean by when I say Hank Crawford, Grover Washington Jr. stories. But it's one of those records that weren't. It wasn't supposed to be Idris Muhammad's record, and it ended up being Idris Muhammad. It's a great record on CTI. Randy Brecker on trumpet, Grover Washington Jr. on saxophone. Oh my goodness, I went. It's Bob James on piano, and I can't remember bass. I apologize. I want to say who I think it was, but I don't want to be wrong. But anyway, it's a great record, and that was kind of my introduction into Idris Muhammad, which wasn't a quote unquote straight ahead introduction into Idris Muhammad. But then, as the years progressed, you know, there were so many people I got a chance to hear him play with, and he actually was on a record with Bobby Watson where they recorded a tune um, entitled "Two Stepping with Dawn" that I composed for my wife Dawn, and Bobby Watson, recorded it with Idris Muhammad. So there's a lot of connections there, but I had never really formally met Idris. I had been in a room with him, but honestly, he was a bit intimidating to me. So after that, years later, Curtis Lundy called me to do a soundtrack for a movie, or I guess it wasn't a documentary. I'm sorry, soundtrack for a documentary called The Farm. The Farm was a documentary about the prison in Angola, um, Louisiana, and we did that. So I got there. It was tons of cats on the record date, but Idris Muhammad was the drummer. And I was just, it was at what used to be called Sorcerer Sound. I think that's what it was called. So I got there. Curtis gave me the music. We talked about it. We recorded a few tunes. Hammy and Blue It was on it. It was some schooling going on for me. This is years ago. And after we got about three tunes down, Curtis was like, "Oh, let's take a little break." We took a break, and I don't know if I'm pretty sure it was Sorcerer Sound, but the piano was in a booth, and then there was another booth, and then the drums were like this way, so you couldn't see the drum booth, but you could in a way. So I wasn't sure if Idris got up off the drums. You know, I'm sorry if Mr. Muhammad got off the drums. So everybody left the room, and I felt like practicing. So I'm playing piano. I'm playing. I'm thinking I'm by myself because everybody left the room. Took my headphones off. I'm just playing and playing and playing and playing and playing. I'm like trying stuff and banging and I'm going crazy. I'm going crazy. And out of nowhere, I hear, "Ah! Ah! Ah!" And I'm like, what the heck? So I pick up my headphones. I'm like, what is that noise? Yo! 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 And I'm like, no. I'm like, what? Like, what is happening? I'm looking to see did I miss anything. Piano player! Piano player! And I'm like, yeah. Practice your shit at home! Now at that point, I could be totally like, oh my goodness, blah blah blah. All this is about Idris Muhammad, but he taught me something. It was break time. Practice my stuff at home. I could be mad. I can't even use that word when I speak to him. I mean, speak about him. I could, be like, oh man, Idris Muhammad vibe. No, but he didn't vibe me. He taught me something. He taught me something that I still use today, and that was probably 20 years ago. And I thank him for that. I thank him for that. I ain't even gonna lie. I was scared. I was like, okay. And I got off the piano. Now, my first initial response, I'm not gonna lie to you too. I was like, man, what? I'm practicing. I'm practicing piano because I'm a young piano player. But the reality is, I should have just got off the piano and like took a break with everybody else. And I'm banging on the piano. Engineers are doing stuff. They're hearing the piano. It was break time. So I didn't say much else to him that night. I didn't really say much else because I was like, ooh, I was a little intimidated. Years later, I met Guimarães in Portugal. I met the jazz festival there, and Mr. Muhammad was there with the great Ahmad Jamal. And I'm like, oh wow, this is an opportunity to go talk to him. And I was still scared from something that happened at that time, 15 years ago. So I'm like, okay. And they were sitting there with this vibe, like, don't come up and say nothing to us, you know. And a lot of other things happened that day at that moment that I won't really get into. But not anyway. So I was like, okay, I'm going to go over and say something. We were eating dinner, and they were eating dinner, and I went over and I'm like, because what you say is really, you're like, hey, I'm really a big fan of yours, Mr. Ahmad Jamal. And like, then it's just like, okay. But I needed to do that. So I went over and I said something to him, and then I started to tell Mr. Muhammad about the experience I had with him years ago. I started to talk about it, and my phone rang. And that's a whole nother story. But what I will tell you is when the phone rang, the person that I ended up talking to in that conversation ended up passing away that night. That night. So I said something to that person, and then I got off the phone, and then they passed away that night, and I never talked to them again. So I never finished my conversation with Mr. Muhammad, and he was a little bit more cordial that day. But I'm telling you, I walked into something when I tried to talk to Ahmad Jamal and Idris Muhammad. It was like, look, we eating dinner. What you coming with, dude? What? You got a couple records out? What? But I had the opportunity and the experience to say that I met these people, and no matter what, I mean, it's Idris Muhammad, it's Ahmad Jamal. Like I was like, woof. And I thank God for that experience to sit and talk to Idris Muhammad, even if I was nervous, even if my heart was beating like this, even if he wasn't the nicest guy at that moment. This was Idris Muhammad. He recorded a tune that I wrote with someone. Um, Ride Symbol? Come on, dude. Ride Symbol? We don't need to talk that much more about it. And his Ride Symbol. So I really thank those people for being real with me and teaching me something. And teaching me something I needed to know. To this day, if we're on a break in the studio, I don't really sit there and bang on the piano. And he actually, let me tell you this, he actually explained it to me. But I was so scared later. He was like, man, I'm, young blood, man. Why are you banging on the piano that we recording on? It's going to go out of tune and blah, blah, blah. And I never thought about it like that. I'm thinking I'm practicing. But no, we're using that instrument to record. So he taught me a lot. And I really thank him. I thank Curtis Lundy for even putting me in that experience, in that situation to experience Idris Muhammad. And I wasn't vibed. I was educated. There comes a certain point in your life where you have to realize the difference between being vibed and educated and where it's coming from. Like, where is it coming from? It's coming from a place of love. Even if it's not, like, what can you learn from it? Second, I also today, a couple minutes ago, received a text about another gentleman, great bassist Keith Muller. And I'm only looking at my phone because I still don't feel like it's real. And I'm like, before I even talk about it, I want to make sure. Okay, I'm sure. Keith Muller is a bass player that I met through Tim Warfield. Thank you, Tim Warfield. And I was still in high school. And I used to play with Keith with Lenny Robinson. And we used to play all around like the central Pennsylvania area. And I thank Tim Warfield for those opportunities. But there were two instances where I had to deal with Keith where I learned a lot. One, uh, Keith wasn't actually on the gig. The gig was Johnny Coles, Buster Williams, Greg McDonald, and Rob Landon. And I was on my way to the gig. I had this like Chrysler, white and blue Chrysler. I don't know if anybody remembers that, Chrysler Fifth Avenue car that I used to have. And I got a flat on the way to the gig. It was the Harrisburg Jazz Festival. On my way to the gig, I'm like freaking out. This is before cell phones. I called Mr. Tim Warfield Sr. And I'm like, oh, I'm stuck on the turnpike because this is before cell phones. And he's like, well, son, you should have left in time. And he was right. It was like, okay, all right, cool. So I got the tire changed and I got to the gig and I was running in right at the gig. I ended up doing a gig. Johnny Cole said nothing to me, nothing. He was like, cool, play. We played the gig. And Johnny Coles invited me up to his room after. Well, not invited me. I was getting paid. He said, come to my room to get paid. So I came to his hotel room to get paid. And he was basically like, I was like, man, I got a flat tire. I was looking for sympathy. I got a flat tire. I didn't leave on time. They didn't let me change it on the turnpike. It was a turnpike. And he just sat back, lit his cigarette, and he said, you should have left earlier. If you got a gig, you should leave in enough time to make your gig. I'm still working on that. I'm making my gigs on time. But, and that was more than 20 years ago. And, at that point, I was like, come on, man. I'm like, come on, man. I got a flat tire. I'm 18 years old. What do you want? And I went downstairs. It was in the Harrisburg Hilton or whatever, something like that. And I went downstairs. And when I got downstairs to the lobby, a.k.a. the bar, Keith Muller was in the bar. And I was just really depressed. I was like, man, I played my behind off, I thought. I got my first opportunity to play with Buster Williams. And, like, Johnny just vibed me. And Keith was like, yo, he didn't, they were all older than me. Keith was like, man, relax, man up. You were late for the gig, take it, you got paid, don't be late the next time. So right after that, I had a gig with Tim Warfield at some house party. I don't know if Tim remembers this. Some house party in Baltimore. I got lost. This is before GPS. At that time, oh, you know what? Reverse the story, but it doesn't matter. This happened in reverse, but it doesn't matter. I had this yellow Monte Carlo. I can only tell the story reverse because of the car. And I got to the gig and I got lost, no GPS. I'm like, where am I going? Keith Muller and Lenny Robinson and Tim Warfield. I run in there and I'm like, a little house party. We're playing like somebody's living room. And man, Keith messed with me that entire gig for being late. Entire gig. I mean, like, everything he said was messing with me. And I look back now, I won't say names, but I'll say this certain trombonist that's from Philly, and he's black, and his last name is Hunter. I see him mess with a certain bass player. I won't say his name. Sometimes, and I see that bass player getting tight, like, I never got tight when Keith was messing with me, man, because I knew it was love, and it was like, yo, you were late, man. I like, just laugh. You were late. You get over it. Come on, man. I'm sitting there sweating, trying to get through this gig at these people's houses, and I just say, man, if it's coming from love, you're not being vibed. You're not being vibed. You're being educated. You're being educated, and I thank God for the opportunity to be educated by Idris Muhammad. I thank God for the opportunity to be educated by Keith Muller. I thank God for the opportunity to be educated by so many other people that came before me. Now, granted, if you're not man, I'm just saying, if you're not man enough to take it, then cool. Yeah, maybe you want it a little bit softer. You want it, I saw somebody else. Anyway, maybe you want it a little bit softer, but you wanted like, oh, this is what I want to tell you. I don't know. I grew up with a bunch of hardcore uncles and hardcore cousins. Hardcore cousins. My cousin just hardcore, It wasn't no like, oh, Warren, you're doing well. You should really work on it. It's like, yo, shut up. Back right on the back of your head. But I knew they loved me. So all this 14 minutes and 47 seconds to say thank you to Idris Muhammad for going on the back of my head. Thank you to Keith Muller for going on the back of my head. And so many other people that continue to do that. And I know it's all about love. I wasn't being vibed. I was being loved and educated. Rest in peace, Idris Muhammad. Rest in peace, Keith Muller.